the talk is about my new book, which traces the trajectory of China's rise dynamics of Chinese foreign policy and the forces, driving forces behind that. For the first question, people ask me when I give the book talk or just talking to people at book is why you wrote this book. Why I wrote this book for two reasons. One is empirical. The other is theoretical. Empirically, I'm teaching the class of Chinese foreign policy and have not found one systematic, historical in-depth and up-to-date coverage of Chinese foreign policy's transformation. In fact, the most works on Chinese foreign policy has been what I call in my book, say, unidimensional and static. And in fact, talking to Professor Weiss, she confirmed that because most books, almost all the books, narrowly focused on China's bilateral relations or certain geographical areas during certain periods. And so a systematic and historically in-depth coverage of Chinese foreign policy has been mysteriously lacking when I did my research. And so my book provides historically what I try to promote, historically in-depth and up-to-date analysis of foreign policy transition in China. And theoretically, structural realism and regime type theories have been used most often to understand Chinese foreign policy behavior. Structural realism has focused on relative power and argues that when China's relative power expands, its ambition and expands, a more powerful China will inevitably redefine its interests expansively and challenge the US dominance, intensify territorial disputes with its neighbors. And, but this theory may help us to understand the last couple years, last decade of China's increasing aggressive behavior. But if you look whole period of PRC history of 70 years, you find when China's relative power was weak in the early period of PRC, Mao Zedong's foreign policy was very aggressive and very confrontational. China fought, in my book, I documented 6 wars, including the war in Korea with the most powerful nation in the world. When China was relatively weak, China fought war also with the Soviet Union, with India. And so relative power in that case cannot explain China's revolutionary foreign policies. And Deng Xiaoping moderated Chinese foreign policy, while China's relative power did not change that much. And Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao continued the moderation of Chinese foreign policy, but China's relative power increased dramatically during those years. And Xi Jinping today has making Chinese foreign policy increasingly confrontational. But I don't see China's relative power has been increased that much in the last 10 years. And in fact, Chinese economic growth has been slowed down since Xi Jinping came to office. So that's why scholars argue that Suisheng Zhao book, the title, I like that, China is overreached, overplayed its hand beyond its capacity. So capacity in that case is not correlated to the foreign policy behavior. So in this case, structural realism has problems to understand the whole period Chinese foreign policy. Regime type theory will argue that China's confrontational aggressive behavior is determined by its authoritarian system. If you want to change China's foreign policy behavior, you have to have change its regime. But China's regime has remained authoritarian all the time. Chinese foreign policy has experienced many turns and shifts. So regime type theory cannot explain that well either. So my book tried to go beyond those mainstream theoretical arguments, try to focus on leaders. What I called in my book, I developed a leadership-centered framework, argued that leaders matter in all political systems, but matter more in totalitarian and authoritarian systems. Elect leaders in democracies are constrained by oppositional parties, public opinions, and electoral cycles, all those things. But authoritarian leaders in China, where the emphasis is hierarchy, discipline, so-called democratic centralism, these leaders are relatively unconstrained by those forces in democratic countries. But the puzzle here for my book, the problem is that not all the leaders are equal. In other words, not every paramount leader has been able to use those authoritarian power to make history, to make policy changes in history. In my book, look at 8 leaders: Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Zhao Ziyang, Hu Yaobang, and Jiang Zemin. Hua Guofeng before that, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, now Xi Jinping, the 8 leaders. So not every leaders are same. And in order to answer that question, I distinguished Chinese leaders into 3 types. One type is what I call transformational leaders. These are game changers. Why they are game changers? They have new visions. Not only they have new visions, they survive. They have survived the jungle of power politics in the PRC, which is very, very nasty. And they have those ideational, all the kind of ideals to inspire followers and mobilize domestic resources and strategically respond to international challenges. Who are those transformational leaders? Of course, I look at only 3: Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping. Mao Zedong charted a very unique foreign policy path, what I called revolutionary foreign policy. And the Chinese official language, they use that Mao Zedong made China stand up. Deng Xiaoping shifted Mao Zedong's revolutionary policy and developed what I called developmental policy, to make foreign policy to serve China's economic development objectives. And he, in the Chinese official language, made China rich. Xi Jinping has changed Deng Xiaoping's moderate developmental policy into what he called big power diplomacy, which is to make China strong. Second type is what I call transactional leaders. These leaders, normally they will not have new visions and follow the course set by their predecessor. These 2 leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, are typical transactional leaders. They followed the course set by Deng Xiaoping. The third type I call failed leaders. They might have new visions, but they cannot survive the jungle of power struggle in the PRC. And Hua Guofeng, he did not have new vision. Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, they might have new visions, try to make changes, but failed. So these are the three types of leaders. My book documented the three, how these, my book focused on the three transformational leaders and documented how each of them chartered a new course for Chinese foreign policy. Here, let me see the table. So this is the framework of my book. How these three transformations, what were their new visions and what their power basis, either rely upon charismatic authority or office authority, and how they constructed ideational environment. Here we are talking about they use historical memories and nationalist aspirations, and how they restructured institutional setting to advance their policy agenda, and also how have they exploit external environment. Here we are talking about global power distribution and world order. And this is the book. But today's talk, I would go beyond this book, try to focus on Xi Jinping's power concentration and its implications for Chinese foreign policy. Power of Chinese foreign policy making has always been concentrated in the hands of paramount leaders, but they are supported by huge bureaucratic hierarchy at three levels. At top is the decision-making institution. What normally we are talking about Politburo Standing Committee, and Central Committee. And at next level, very important for the foreign policy making, for all the policy making in China, is that kind of opaque, behind the scene, policy coordination and elaboration institutions. And these institutions, they played a very important role trying to coordinate all those stakeholders in the interdepartmental level on those urgent, novel issues for the top leaders. Then below that is so-called line bureaucracies in the party government and the military. Each transformational leaders have different leadership styles to work with the hierarchy. Mao Zedong, as the founder of the PRC, he was a charismatic leader and what I call a crusader. And he met foreign policies top-down, especially on those strategic and national security issues. And he did not like bureaucracy, so he delegated the authority to deal with bureaucracy to his premier, Zhou Enlai. And so Korean War, all those issues basically met in the personal level by him. And Deng Xiaoping, he was a pragmatic, strong man. And he never held top party government positions, but he placed his proteges at top position and pulled the string behind. His style was, the term I use, delegation by consensus. He delegated the authorities of decision-making to the bureaucracy. And he ratified those decisions if they reach consensus. He was consensus builder. And he stepped in only if they cannot reach consensus. So that was his style. And Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao continued this type of consensus building process and also held so-called collective leadership. Xi Jinping changed everything. Basically, I don't know if you agree with me, I will argue that he has become the most powerful leader in the PRC history, even to a certain extent more powerful than Mao Zedong, because he eliminated all his rivals or potential rivals, especially in the last year 20th Party Congress. And even Hu Chunhua, that young person, left the Politburo. And he placed all his lawyers in those positions. He running the country at this time, I will argue that without credible rivals. At least I cannot identify them at this point. And so from that perspective, he upset a non-standing practice of power balance at the top echelon. Mao was balanced by Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and some other comrades. Deng Xiaoping was balanced by Chen Yun and some of elders. And Jiang Zemin was balanced by Deng Xiaoping. Hu Jintao was balanced by Jiang Zemin. So who is balancing Xi Jinping today? I don't think I can find any. That's why I argue he is the most powerful leader today. Now the question is, how has Xi Jinping reached this point of power? And what are the foreign policy implications of Xi Jinping's power concentration? I will argue that 3 triggers helped Xi Jinping consolidate his power after becoming General Secretary in 2012. One was the elite's complaints that Hu Jintao's leadership was too weak, and the factional makeup of the collective leadership was too divisive. To curb massive corruption, we all know that, and also liberal ideas. In fact, they argue that this is a threat to the monopoly of power by the Communist Party. The second trigger was high-profile political scandals and corruption cases, just right on time. If without the Bo-Xilai cases, I don't know if Xi Jinping will be there. I just read a new book, 红色赌盘. I just came from Hong Kong. You can tell all the stories. We don't know, but that helped him. Bo-Xilai, Zhou Yongkang, Lin Jihua, those cases just came right on time. He took the party general secretary position. And third trigger was the rising nationalist aspiration and also frustration among the Chinese elites that China, after the Olympic game 2008, and also the following year, the U.S. started from U.S. financial meltdown. They thought the U.S. was in trouble. They should respect China's so-called core national interests. But U.S., they look at, still try to undermine China's rise. So they're frustrated, looking for someone to stand up against those situations. So Xi Jinping came to office using those triggers to establish himself as a visionary, strong leader, and launched anti-corruption campaign and proposed the vision of China Dream and great rejuvenation. And so those are the triggers helped Xi Jinping's power concentration. So in fact, he came to office with consent. I don't know if you remember, I still remember the first couple of years, people had not hope toward Xi Jinping as reformer and reformist strong leader. But we were all wrong at that time, in fact. And Xi Jinping's power concentration has a very important institutional implication or institutional dimension. He has restructured the foreign and national security policy-making institutions at all 3 levels. This is the structure of foreign policy-making institutions in Xi Jinping's China. And so the top level, I talked about Politburo Standing Committee, then the coordination level and bureaucracy level. Let me very quickly, briefly talk about all these 3 levels. At this level, he established a very strong personal authority. In fact, the personal loyalty to himself as the core law that guide interactions of top political elites. That's what he did. I don't want to talk about those institutional restructuring and those cult personality building process. But this is a very, very powerful institutional restructure. Let me focus on these two levels, because these two levels are directly relevant to the foreign and national security policy making in China. Below the top decision-making institutions are what I called policy coordination and consultation institution. The foreign policy front, the most important one for many years since 1981, the long-standing foreign policy coordination institution was Foreign Affairs Leadership Small Group. In fact, that small group was first established by Mao Zedong in 1958. Seven leadership small groups. Foreign affairs was one of them. But it was banned during the Cultural Revolution in 1970. And Deng Xiaoping restored that in 1981. That's why I put 1981. And then, after the embassy bombing in 1999, people talk about China-led crisis management institution, coordination. Jiang Zemin built the second small leadership group called National Security Leadership Small Group in 2000. Then in 2009, the maritime disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea intensified. China had so many institutions, they call 九龙戏水, all those 9 institutions fighting for the authority. So Hu Jintao built leadership, protecting maritime rights and interest leadership group in 2010. The problem here is that all those institutions shared the staff support in the Central Foreign Affairs Office, 中央外办, Chinese call that. And so they suffered the lack of full-time staff support to make regular foreign policy coordination, analysis, all those problems. Xi Jinping came to office, quickly realized that. And this became part of his institutional restructuring. The first thing he did, 2013, was to build the State Security Commission, which I read that document was not only a coordination institution, but also they call coordination and decision-making institution. Very powerful. But for Xi Jinping talking about national security, the first thing in his mind is internal security. When he talked about National Security Commission job, he talked about regime security. He called political security, which is a code word of regime security, and emphasized that. So that institution, since 2013, has been shifted toward the focus on internal security. So Xi Jinping upgraded the Central Foreign Affairs Leadership Group into Central Foreign Affairs Commission. What is the difference between commission and the leadership small group? Clear. Commission is more formal and more bureaucratic, with more bureaucratic authority. And Xi Jinping, in that case, enhanced the foreign policy coordination institutions, authorities. And also, he used all those high-level Central Foreign Affairs work conferences. Before him, there were only 3. Mao Zedong had 1, Jiang Zemin had 1, Hu Jintao had 1. His first 10 years, he held 3. Then he also changed those 5 years time, those Chinese diplomat envoys meeting into annual meeting. Basically, he tried very hard to make sure his policy ideas, agenda is understood well by those foreign policy bureaucracy, very politicized, these institutions. At next level, bureaucratic level, Xi Jinping has what I called politicized, and also enlarged foreign policy bureaucracy. in terms of politicization, it's so clear. For many years since Deng Xiaoping started reform, Chinese diplomats saw themselves as professionals. You talk to those new graduate recruited from the elite universities, very often foreign language, university, international studies, and they were also recognized as professionals. But there was a paradoxical transformation of the political status of Chinese diplomats. More they become professionalized, the less politically important they became. The post-foreign minister position used to be Politburo member, vice premier. But in Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin years, we talked about professionalization. The highest level they could get was state councilor. Xi Jinping came to office, reversed this trend, but emphasized political loyalty over professionalism. You are first not professionals. You are first the soldiers of the Communist Party of China. So that's what Xi Jinping has emphasized. And in the meantime, he has also expanded the mandate of many other institutions, the party diplomacy, which came as a new term. Although there was party departments such as United Front Department, International Liaison Department, and the Propaganda Department, they engaged international activities, but most time was behind the scene, was not in the forefront. Xi Jinping changed the whole thing, give them more resources and move them to the forefront. And also Xi Jinping has tightened military diplomacy. And before him, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao somehow lost absolute control of military. He now has made sure himself as the CMC, Central Military Commission Chairman, has absolute control on military and also military diplomacy. In fact, one of the institutional change was he moved the International Exchange Office of the Defense Ministry into the Central Military Commission. Under him, direct command. So the whole foreign policy, national security bureaucracy has been politicized and enlarged. Chinese have a term called 大外交, the enlarged diplomacy. Finally, let me talk about what are the foreign policy implications. There are many implications. Let me briefly mention three I think are very important in connection with institutional restructuring. One is the change in the incentive structure of the Chinese diplomats from performing as professionals to demonstrating political loyalty as the means not only for the rising in the ranks, but also survival. And so they have responded very enthusiastic. That's what we see those Chinese diplomats, they're so different now, to see his call for fighting spirit, 斗争精神, baseline thinking, 底线思维, and pursuing core national interests. We cannot compromise those. And so we see the behavior of the Chinese diplomats change entirely. Ministry of Foreign Affairs used to receive the calcium tablets for making of bones. But now they recast themselves as defender of the Chinese national interests. And they are now known as the Ministry of Wolf Warriors. And we all know those diplomats. Let me give you two examples. Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. Yang Jiechi, he spoke so good English. And he was a friend of a Bush family known as Tiger Yang. Very professional. He changed entirely since he worked under Xi Jinping's institutional setting. became a very, very lone wolf warrior. Wang Yi is another example. I met himself. He was polite, very humble person. And he was being a scholar at Georgetown for half a year. People thought he was professional, but now he is another big wolf warrior. And Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, the first meeting with Joe Biden administration was such a beyond anyone's imagination. US, you are no longer qualified to speak from the position of strength. You can no longer promote your democracy. And Wang Yi added that you have to change your bad habits, 老毛病, bad habits to interfere in our domestic affairs. Charles Brown in the US territory, they should apologize. Maybe they at first said regret, but Wang Yi at the Munich, that meeting, so defensive, accused US overreaction, everything. These are diplomats, wolf warriors. Because of the institutional structural change, the enlarged diplomacy also changed Chinese foreign policy behavior. The US now is so alert about influence operation of China in the US, which are those institutions, the party institutions, the United Front Department, Propaganda Department, and liaison, international liaison department. And the military, we see Taiwan issue now become so intense because Xi Jinping has emphasized the military should be ready to fight. So they used coercive diplomacy. So military diplomacy has been very much used in this direction. Second, this institutional restructuring that this type of more confrontational foreign policy has inevitably met with pushback and resistance from the US and other countries. Xi Jinping has perceived these as threats to China's regime and national security. So he has proposed a new concept to guide China's foreign policy and overall policy. For many years, Deng Xiaoping emphasized developmental objectives and emphasized the first priority is development. Xi Jinping said, yeah, development is still important, but security is equally important. So he elevated national security to the top priority of Chinese foreign policy. And that's what his 统筹发展和安全, integrated approach to develop and security. This is a very important change because this reflected his perception of China's international environment, more threatening, more dangerous, and also domestically, very dangerous. In the 20th Party Congress, he dropped two very important phrases, peace and development dropped, and also the window of opportunity for China development dropped. And this elevation of security into the priority has increased Xi Jinping of Chinese foreign policy risk tolerance of escalation and pushback, especially in the economic front. And this has also very important implications for China's development. Chinese economy not only slowed down under this guidance, but a lot of Chinese people are leaving China today. And foreign investments are leaving China too. The final point I want to mention is that Xi Jinping does not have Mao Zedong's charismatic power. In the last 10 years, what he has accomplished, he cannot compare. He has concentrated power, but his power is not based upon his accomplishments, based on what? Coercion. Basically, people followed him because of fear. That's what happened in China today. In that context, those who nobody would want to tell him if he makes mistake. Nobody would dare to disagree with him. Anyone disagree with him will be labeled as 妄议中央, actually commenting against the center, now becoming even more personal, maliciously slandering party and state leaders. So this has minimized the opportunities of his mistakes being corrected. So China has entered a vicious cycle. Especially after the zero COVID failure last year. And Xi Jinping is making mistakes, which has consequences. Then he became more defensive, makes more mistakes. And this kind of vicious cycle is very dangerous for China's foreign policy future. And if Xi Jinping, in that case, decided to take Taiwan by force, although I would not think rationally he would do that, but we can no longer understand the Chinese foreign policy as a rational action, because the institutional environment has changed entirely. And if he decides that, nobody could stop him. Chinese foreign policy, with all these changes we described, has become incoherent, irrational, and unpredictable. Finally, these three questions you can think if Chinese foreign policy is premature, overreacted, and what will happen in China in the future? I don't know. I'm very, very concerned. Thank you. Thank you again.